Picture this, a cold, wind-beaten cave in the heart of prehistoric Europe. Inside, a shallow pit lined with bones, and at its center, something that sends chills even to modern archaeologists. A skeleton carefully positioned, its skull painted with red ochre, surrounded by strange offerings. Animal bones, tools, and symbols carved into stone. Was this a burial of love, grief, or something far darker? Thousands of years ago, humans stood over this pit, chanting or whispering words we will never know. But why? What drove them to bury their dead in such eerie, ritualistic ways? Some say it was the dawn of religion. Others whisper it was fear of the dead themselves. This is the story of the creepiest prehistoric burial ever discovered. The cave lay silent, its entrance half hidden by time and stone. When archaeologists first stepped inside, they expected the usual signs of prehistoric life: scattered tools, animal bones, the remnants of fire. But as their lights flickered across the cavern floor, something caught their breath. A shallow pit, carefully dug, and within it a skeleton unlike any they had ever seen. The body was not tossed aside or left to decay. It had been placed with deliberate care. Its skull, dusted in red ochre, seemed to glow under the artificial lamps, as though still carrying the mark of a ritual painted tens of thousands of years ago. Around the corpse lay fragments of animal bones, wolf jaws, mammoth ivory, sharpened antlers. They weren't food scraps. They were offerings. Even more unsettling were the stones that lined the grave. Some bore crude carvings, shapes that seemed too intentional to be dismissed as chance. Were these symbols of protection, a message to the living, or warnings carved for the dead themselves? The silence of the cave pressed heavily on the team. This was not just a burial, it was a story written in earth and bone, and it was disturbingly intimate. Every detail suggested thought, intention, and ritual. This was not a random act of disposal. Whoever had laid this body to rest wanted the dead to remain bound, watched over, perhaps even contained. The archaeologists exchanged uneasy glances. They knew they were standing in the middle of a mystery that blurred the line between anthropology and horror. What they had found wasn't just a grave. It was a portal into the minds of people long gone, people who feared and revered death in ways we are only beginning to understand. And this was only the beginning. Burials in the prehistoric record are rare. For most of human evolution, bodies were left to the elements, devoured by scavengers, erased by time. But here, in this cave, someone had broken the pattern. Someone chose to dig. Someone chose to preserve. And that choice changes everything. The skeleton itself revealed even more secrets. Careful analysis showed the bones belonged to a young adult, perhaps in their early 20s. The teeth bore signs of wear, the ribs marks of old injuries. This was a life not unlike our own, full of struggle, pain, and survival. Yet in death, they were honored or perhaps feared with an elaborate ritual. Fragments of red ochre clung to the bones like dried blood. This mineral pigment is one of the oldest symbols in human history, used in art, in markings, and in burial rites across continents. Why smear it onto the body? Was it meant to give life beyond the grave, or to seal the dead away, keeping their spirit bound beneath the earth? The placement of animal remains deepened the mystery. Wolves and mammoths were not just food, they were forces of power. To bury a person with them suggests more than survival. It suggests belief. A belief that these animals carried meaning, perhaps even protection for the one who had crossed into death. And then there were the carvings. Rough, almost clumsy, but undeniably intentional. Some resembled abstract symbols. Others echoed the shape of eyes staring outward. It was as though the stones themselves had been turned into guardians, watching both the dead and the living who dared approach. For archaeologists, the grave was both a revelation and a warning. It challenged their understanding of when ritual began, of when humans first began to wrestle with questions of life after death. This burial shouldn't exist so far back in time, yet here it was, forcing us to reconsider the very dawn of human belief. But the deeper question lingered. Was this burial an act of reverence or an act of fear? The cave did not just hold bones, it held atmosphere. Anyone who stood there described the same sensation, a weight in the air, a strange stillness that seemed to cling to the skin. It was as if the burial had preserved not only a body but an emotion. Something unspoken lingered in the shadows. Forensic analysis added yet another unsettling layer. Tiny traces of soot were found in the soil, suggesting fires had been lit around the grave. Were these torches part of a ritual procession? Did the mourners chant, pray, or plead? The ashes hinted at gatherings, where firelight danced across stone walls as people confronted death in a way we can only imagine. What unsettled researchers most was the sheer intentionality. Every detail, the ochre paint, the animal offerings, the carved stones, pointed to a worldview that was complex, symbolic, and deeply emotional. This was not the work of creatures fumbling blindly toward culture. This was humanity, raw and ancient, already wrestling with the biggest questions. What happens when we die? Where does the spirit go? Can it harm us if left uncontained? Some argued it was the first evidence of religion. Others claimed it was evidence of fear, that prehistoric people did not honor their dead so much as they tried to keep them at bay. After all, to carve symbols, paint skulls, and bury bodies deep underground is to acknowledge that death is powerful, perhaps too powerful. Standing in that cave, one cannot help but feel the same chill. We are separated from those ancient mourners by tens of thousands of years, yet their actions speak directly to us. They remind us that the struggle to understand death, to ritualize it, to make it less terrifying, has been with us since the very beginning. And yet, as haunting as this burial was, it was only a glimpse. The real question was why? What drove these people, our distant kin, to create such a chilling ritual in the first place? That answer lies in the next chapter. When scientists looked at the burial, they saw more than bones in the ground. They saw the beginnings of something profoundly human, the spark of belief. For the first time, people weren't just surviving day to day. They were pausing to ask questions about existence, about the meaning of death, and perhaps about what lies beyond. Red ochre, animal offerings, carved stones, all of these spoke of symbolism. These were not random choices. They were acts layered with meaning. But what kind of meaning? Some scholars argue this was an early form of religion, a way of honoring the dead and granting them passage into another world. To smear pigment to offer powerful animals was to give the departed strength for a journey none of the living could follow. Yet others interpret it differently. To them, this burial was not about respect, it was about control. Early humans may have feared that the dead could rise, that their restless spirits could wander among the living. In that view, the ochre was not a blessing but a seal, a way of binding the corpse to the earth. The offerings were not gifts, but bribes to keep the spirit satisfied. What makes this debate so fascinating is that both possibilities reveal the same truth. Even tens of thousands of years ago, humans were not content to let death be an accident of nature. They needed ritual. They needed story. Whether out of reverence or fear, they treated the dead with care and intention. This was the first flicker of belief, the recognition that life was more than breath and bone, and that death demanded explanation. It is a moment when humanity began to step beyond survival into myth, ritual, and meaning. But belief alone cannot explain the burial's eerie atmosphere. To truly understand it, we must ask, were these people mourning or protecting themselves from something darker? Imagine standing in that cave thousands of years ago, torchlight flickering against the walls. The body lies in the pit, its skull painted red, surrounded by offerings that feel less like gifts and more like warnings. The mourners lower their heads, but are they grieving or trembling? Fear is perhaps the oldest companion of death. Long before philosophy, long before religion, there was dread. Early humans lived in a world where survival was fragile, and death could arrive suddenly through famine, predators, or disease. To them, a corpse wasn't only a lifeless body, it was a mystery, a threshold to the unknown. What if the dead could return? What if their spirit lingered, angry or vengeful? This is why some researchers interpret the burial as an act of protection. The red ochre may have been a barrier, a kind of spiritual paint sealing the body away. The animal bones, especially the jaws of predators, might not have been blessings but symbols of dominance meant to intimidate the spirit. And the carved stones, guardians watching silently, ensuring the dead stayed where they belonged. Even the placement of the grave inside a cave hints at fear. Caves are liminal spaces, dark, hidden, separate from daily life. To bury someone there is to push them out of the world of the living and into a realm of shadows. It suggests the mourners wanted distance, a boundary between themselves and the one they buried. And yet fear does not erase grief. If anything, it intensifies it. The people who performed this ritual may have loved the one they buried, but love alone could not quiet the terror of the unknown. They needed barriers, symbols, and ceremony to face the darkness. In this way, the burial reveals not only fear of the dead, but fear of what death itself might mean. Not every explanation of the burial rests on fear. Some archaeologists believe the ritual spoke of love, the kind of love that refuses to let go, even in the face of death. To place a body with care, to decorate it with ochre, to surround it with objects of meaning, these are not acts of cold calculation. They are gestures of memory, of longing, of hope that something of the person endures. Imagine the mourners as family. Perhaps a mother laid her child in that pit. Perhaps a group of hunters buried their companion, a friend who once shared their fire. The offerings may have been chosen with tenderness, the jaw of a wolf for its strength, ivory for its beauty, symbols carved to keep watch over the one they cherished. In this view, the burial becomes the earliest trace of humanity's refusal to accept finality. It is grief transformed into ritual, sorrow carved into stone. Death was not the end. It was a passage. The red ochre wasn't a seal but a blessing, a way of giving life back to the earth while carrying hope that something beyond awaited. What makes this prehistoric grave so haunting is that both interpretations, fear and love, exist side by side. The same gestures that could bind a spirit might also honor it. The same offerings that could intimidate might also comfort. This duality reflects a truth we still grapple with today. Death is terrifying, but it is also deeply human, bound with memory, love, and meaning. Standing in that cave, we see not just bones, but the dawn of a struggle that continues within us. We seek to understand death, to soften its cruelty with ritual, to find in its silence either comfort or control. And perhaps that is why this burial is the creepiest of all, not only for what it says about them, but for what it reveals about us. The cave is silent now. The torches have burned out, the mourners long gone, their voices lost to history. But the burial remains, bones, ochre, stones, and offerings frozen in time. It whispers to us across tens of thousands of years, reminding us that the line between fear and love, between ritual and superstition, has always been blurred. We call it the creepiest prehistoric burial ever discovered, not because of the bones alone, but because of what it reveals about us. That even at the dawn of humanity, we wrestled with the same questions we ask today. What is death? Is there something after? Do the dead linger, or do they move on? In the shadows of that ancient cave, we glimpse the very beginnings of belief, the fragile bridge between survival and meaning. And in those eerie symbols, we see the first attempts to face eternity. Perhaps that is why the burial unsettles us. It shows that the fear of death, the hope of life beyond it, and the love that binds us to one another are not modern inventions. They are as old as humanity itself. So the next time you think of prehistoric people as primitive, remember the pit lined with bones, the skull painted red, the offerings carved by trembling hands. Remember that they too were haunted by death and driven to make sense of it. And now I'll leave you with a question. If you stood in that cave today, staring down at that ancient grave, would you feel reverence or fear?